This is Biopsychology revision. Biopsychology features on paper 2 alongside approaches and research methods. This paper is worth 96 marks and is 2 hours long. Biopsychology is worth 24 marks and you will have 30 minutes on this section. According to the advanced information, you will need to cover the divisions of the nervous system, the structure and function of sensory, relay and motor neurons, the process of synaptic transmission, localization of function in the brain and hemispheric lateralization, plasticity and functional recovery, and ways of studying the brain. We will begin with the divisions of the nervous system. If we have a look here, so we're looking at the central and peripheral nervous system and the somatic and autonomic divisions of the peripheral nervous system. We have a diagram here, and I do think the diagram is really useful in terms of revision. So having the nervous system split up like this, you can see you've got the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system as the two main divisions. Within the central nervous system, you've got the brain and spinal cord. Within the peripheral nervous system, you've got two further divisions of the autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system. Within the autonomic nervous system, you have two further divisions, and you have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So having it in a diagram format, I think, is really useful because you can visualise that. You can even draw that out in the exam when you're answering a question, and you can elaborate on key points if necessary, if it's a longer answer question, for example. We'll have a look at some of the parts of this in a bit more detail. So, the nervous system consists of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. It is a specialised network of cells in the human body and is our primary internal communication system. It is based on electrical and chemical signals. The nervous system has two main functions: to collect, process and respond to information in the environment, to coordinate the work of different organs and cells in the body. As I've mentioned, when we look at that diagram, the nervous system is divided into two subsystems: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and then we've got a bit of information about each. So the brain is the centre of all conscious awareness. The brain has an outer layer, the cerebral cortex, and this is only found in mammals. The brain is divided into two hemispheres, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail when we look at hemispheric lateralization. The spinal cord is an extension of the brain. It passes messages to and from the brain and connects nerves to the peripheral nervous system. It is also responsible for reflex actions such as pulling your hand away from a hot plate. So the reflex actions, when we look at the different types of neurons, sensory, relay and motor, they're involved in reflex actions. The peripheral nervous system transmits messages via millions of neurons to and from the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into the autonomic nervous system, which transmits information to and from internal body organs. It is automatic as the system operates involuntary. It has two main divisions: the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. It controls vital functions in the body, such as breathing, heart rate, digestion, arousal, and stress responses. The somatic nervous system transmits information from receptor cells in the sense organs to the central nervous system. It also receives information from the central nervous system that directs muscles to act. If we have a look, so we've got some information about the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions here. So these are biological changes associated with the sympathetic and parasympathetic response. The sympathetic state increases heart rate, increases breathing rate, dilates pupils, inhibits digestion, inhibits saliva production, contracts rectum. Parasympathetic state decreases heart rate, increases breathing rate, constricts pupils, stimulates digestion, stimulates saliva production, relaxes rectum. So if we think about it, the sympathetic state is speeding things up and the parasympathetic state is slowing things down. So if you go through a fight or flight response, your sympathetic state will be initiated. And then when the threat is no longer there, you will go through that parasympathetic state. Fight or flight is not on the advanced information. However, with regards to how the nervous system works, I would make sure that you have a look at fight or flight and you have a look at some of those exam questions, which are application questions, which look at the nervous system, because they do link to the fight or flight response. So have a look at those application questions on past papers, and I think there's a couple on your worksheet as well. So have a look at these and make sure you're aware of how the sympathetic and parasympathetic, the autonomic and somatic nervous systems link in with this idea of fight or flight and how they might come up in some exam questions. Although it doesn't specifically say it in the advanced information, it is something that you should make sure you are aware of with regards to your revision. So have a little look over that and link that into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic state. So have a go at those exam questions, fill out the key terms that we've just covered, and then we'll move on to the structure and function of neurons. Okay, so let's have a look at the structure and function of neurons. So you need to be aware of the structure and function of sensory, relay and motor neurons. When you come across some exam questions, I haven't put the diagram questions in the worksheet, but you can find some of the diagram questions on the past papers and you can have a look at some of these diagram questions. Here are diagrams of each of the different neurons. So you've got the sensory neuron, which has a cell body and it has dendrites, has a myelin sheath and nodes of Ranvier. And then you have the relay neuron, which has axons and dendrites around the outside. And then you have the motor neuron, which has the cell body and the axon and the dendrites at one end, whereas the sensory neuron has dendrites on two ends and the cell body in the centre, and the motor neuron has the cell body at one side and the dendrites at the other side. So make sure you're aware of how each of the neurons look. There are some exam questions where you have to label them or you have to identify them from images and say which one is which. I think this came up on the exam a few years ago. It was a question with some diagrams and you had to name the different neurons from by using the diagram. So make sure you are aware of how these look as well as their function. So we'll have a little read of the structure of a neuron. Neurons vary in size from less than a millimetre up to a metre long, but all share the same basic structure. The cell body includes a nucleus, which contains the genetic material of the cell. Branch-like structures called dendrites protrude from the cell body. These carry nerve impulses from neighbouring neurons towards the cell body. The axon carries the impulses away from the cell body down the length of the neuron. The axon is covered in a fatty layer of myelin sheath that protects the axon and speeds up electrical transmission of the impulse. There are gaps between the myelin sheath. If it was continuous, this would have the reverse effect and slow down the electrical impulse. Thus, the myelin sheath is segmented by gaps called nodes of Ranvier. These speed up the transmission of the impulse by forcing it to jump across the gaps in the axon. Finally, at the end of the axon are terminal buttons that communicate with the next neuron in the chain across a gap known as the synapse. So when we look at synaptic transmission, that also links back to how neurons work, and that in turn links to the central and peripheral nervous systems. So you've got your 3 neurons. Motor neurons connect the central nervous system to effectors, such as muscles and glands. They have short dendrites and long axons. Their cell bodies are in the central nervous system, so that's your brain and spinal cord. And they have long axons which form part of the peripheral nervous system. Sensory neurons, these carry messages from the peripheral nervous system to the central nervous system. They have long dendrites and short axons. They are located in the peripheral nervous system in clusters known as ganglia. Relay neurons, these connect the sensory neurons to the motor or other relay neurons. They have short dendrites and short axons. They make up 97% of all neurons, and most are found within the brain and spinal cord. Then we have this information about electrical transmission. The firing of a neuron. So when a neuron is in a resting state, the inside of the cell is negatively charged compared to the outside. When a neuron is activated by a stimulus, the inside of the cell becomes positively charged for a split second, causing an action potential to occur. This creates an electrical impulse that passes down the axon towards the end of the neuron. So you've got quite a lot of information there. You need to be aware, so motor neurons connect to muscle cells, and sensory neurons connect to your sensory organs. So each of these work together, the sensory, relay and motor neurons, in a reflex arc. So for example, if you were to put your finger on a pin, then that sense of touch and pain would be picked up. That would pass down the sensory neuron to the relay neuron, which would pass it back to the motor neuron, and this would connect to an effector or a muscle cell, and you would move your hand out of the way because of that. If you have a look on the worksheet, there are a few exam questions which require you to link the role of sensory, motor and relay neurons to an item and explain what would happen in that item in terms of how the neurons would work. So have a look at that question, have a go at those application questions, And like I said earlier, have a look at the diagram questions and make sure you're able to identify each type of neuron from the diagram also. So fill out your key terms, have a go at the exam questions in the worksheet. Now we will have a look at the process of synaptic transmission. So you need to be aware of the role of neurotransmitters. You need to be aware what excitation and inhibition are also. To help with synaptic transmission, it really helps if you have a diagram. Make sure you label your diagram so you can see that you've got your axon, you've got your synaptic vesicle, you've got the neurotransmitter, you've got the presynaptic nerve terminal or the presynaptic neuron, you've got the synapse, which is the gap in between, postsynaptic receptor sites, which are located on the postsynaptic neuron or postsynaptic nerve. So make sure you draw that diagram. You can label that diagram. Again, I haven't included any labelling questions in the worksheet, but you can find them on the past papers. So have a go at some of those questions. Make sure you can label a diagram with all of these key terms. So make sure you're aware of these key terms and you know where they are on the diagram. So let's read some key information. You need to be able to describe synaptic transmission as well as being able to draw it. You could draw it initially if it helps you in an exam question. So you could draw the diagram that I've just shown you and then you can elaborate on that if it helps. But make sure you're aware of how to explain synaptic transmission in a series of sentences or bullet points at least. Synaptic transmission is the process by which neighbouring neurons communicate with each other by sending chemical messages across the gap, the synapse, that separates them. Neurons communicate with each other within groups known as neural axon networks. Each neuron is separated from the next by a gap called the synapse. Signals within neurons are transmitted electrically and signals between neurons are transmitted chemically across the synapse. So this next bit is the key bit to explain how synaptic transmission works. When the electrical impulse reaches the end of the neuron, the presynaptic terminal, it triggers the release of neurotransmitter from tiny sacs called synaptic vesicles. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that diffuse across the synapse to the next neuron. Once a neurotransmitter crosses the synapse, it is taken up by a postsynaptic receptor site on the dendrites of the next neuron. Here, the chemical message is converted back into an electrical impulse and the process of transmission begins again in this other neuron. Now, there has been an exam question before asking why the process of synaptic transmission can only work in one direction. The direction of travel can only be one way. This is because neurotransmitters are released from the presynaptic neuron terminal and received by the postsynaptic neuron at the receptor sites. So that's the answer to that exam question. Each neurotransmitter has its own specific molecular structure that fits perfectly into a postsynaptic receptor site similar to a lock and key. So this next part is important. It's this idea of excitation and inhibition, which is mentioned on the advanced information. Neurotransmitters have either an excitatory or inhibitory effect on the neighbouring neuron. Excitation. When a neurotransmitter, such as adrenaline, increases the positive charge of the postsynaptic neuron. So that's what excitation is. It increases the positive charge of the postsynaptic neuron. This increases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will pass on the electrical impulse. So excitation is when you have more of positive charge and it increases the likelihood that a message will pass on. Inhibition. This is when a neurotransmitter such as serotonin increases the negative charge of the postsynaptic neuron. This decreases the likelihood that the postsynaptic neuron will pass on the electrical impulse. Summation. The action potential of the postsynaptic neuron is only triggered if the sum of the excitatory and inhibitory signals at any one time reaches the threshold. So summation is a little bit more complicated. I've got a diagram that might help. So basically, if we have a look here, you've got presynaptic axon terminals, and you've got 3 there on the diagram, and if each of them has enough neurotransmitter passing across and connecting with those receptor sites, then it will reach that trigger zone. The action potential will be high enough to pass the threshold, and the message will either pass on or it will be inhibited, according to whether it's an excitatory neurotransmitter or an inhibitory neurotransmitter. If we have a look at the diagram again, if there isn't enough neurotransmitter connecting with those receptor sites, then it will not reach the trigger zone, the threshold within that trigger zone, and there will not be an action potential. So that message, whether it's inhibitory or excitatory, will not be passed on. So draw the diagram, make sure you are aware of all of the labels on that diagram. Make sure you're aware of the process of excitation and inhibition and the role of those neurotransmitters within that synapse. And make sure you're aware of what summation is and how it links to whether a message will be passed on or whether a message will be inhibited. Define the key terms on the worksheet and have a go at the exam questions.